On the sunny morning of May 23, 2024, Alexander Sterling, a 40-90-year-old technology magnate with a fortune of $2.5 billion, woke up in his Park Avenue penthouse in New York City with the feeling that today would change his life. He had no idea how right he would turn out to be. Tall, trim, with shrewd gray eyes and a neatly trimmed beard with a streak of graying, Alexander was used to controlling every aspect of his life. However, the events of the last week had jeopardized everything he had built over 20 years. Alexander reached over to the bedside table and picked up his smartphone. The clock read 5 in the morning, a time when most Manhattan residents were still lounging in their beds. But for Sterling, rising early was the norm. Time is money, he liked to say, a philosophy that had made him one of Silicon Valley's most successful entrepreneurs. He got out of bed and walked over to the panoramic window that took up the entire wall of his bedroom. Before him was a majestic view of Central Park, surrounded by skyscrapers that were already beginning to reflect the first rays of the rising sun. This view usually inspired Alexander, reminding him of what he had accomplished, but today he felt only a heaviness in his chest and an unrelenting anxiety. Sterling sighed and headed for the Italian marble bathroom. Looking at his reflection in the mirror, he noticed that the wrinkles on his forehead had deepened, and new goosebumps had appeared in the corners of his eyes. The last week had not been easy for him. As he shaved, the events of the past few days replayed in his mind. It all started last Thursday, May 16th. Alexander returned from an important meeting with investors, where he presented the latest development of his company Neurotech, a revolutionary artificial intelligence technology capable of predicting the behavior of financial markets with unprecedented accuracy. The presentation was a success, and Sterling was confident that he was about to close a deal worth several $100 million. However, upon entering his office on the top floor of the Neurotech skyscraper in Manhattan, he immediately realized something was wrong. His personal safe, hidden behind a Picasso painting, was open. Inside should have been a folder with a detailed description of the AI algorithm and test results, documents worth billions of dollars. But the folder wasn't there. Alexander remembered the panic that gripped him. He immediately called his head of security, Frank Donovan, a former FBI agent. Together, they reviewed the surveillance footage, but found nothing suspicious. The documents seemed to have simply vanished. The next few days became a nightmare. Sterling hired the best private investigators, but they couldn't find a single lead. He couldn't go to the police for fear of publicity. News of the leak could bring down the company's stock and scare away investors. Alexander remembered sitting in his office last night, reviewing security reports for the 100th time. His gaze accidentally fell on a photograph on the desk. It showed him with his father on their last fishing trip together, a month before the elder Sterling had passed away from a heart attack. "Always remember, son," Alexander heard his father's voice as if it were real. "There's no problem that can't be solved by approaching it from the other side." And then it hit him. He had been so focused on finding the intruder among the senior staff that he had lost sight of the rest of the staff. What if the documents were still in the building, hidden where no one would ever guess to look? Sterling recalled a conversation he overheard by chance a week ago. Two cleaning staff members were discussing a strange package they found in a dumpster in the parking lot. They had taken it to the lost and found at JFK Airport, where one of them worked part-time on weekends. This information had seemed insignificant to Alexander at the time, but now, after getting out of the shower, he began to dress. Instead of the usual suit from Tom Ford for $5,000, he put on simple jeans and a t-shirt. Then he took out of the closet a pre-prepared bag with the uniform of an airport employee. Alexander Sterling, the man who had built a technology empire from the ground up, was about to do something he had never done before, pretend to be a common laborer. He realized it was crazy. One wrong move, and his reputation, his company, everything he'd worked his whole life for, could crumble. But he didn't see any other way out. If the documents were really at the airport, he had a chance to find them before they fell into the wrong hands. Descending to the underground parking lot, Alexander got into not his usual Bentley Bentayga, but an unremarkable 2010 Ford Focus that he had bought yesterday for cash through a front man. He drove out onto the morning streets of New York City, joining the stream of cars rushing to work. As Sterling drove toward JFK Airport, his thoughts returned to how he'd ended up in this situation. 20 years ago, he was just a talented programmer with ambition and a dream to change the world through technology. He had started Neuratech in his parents' garage with only $10,000 in capital, money his father had lent him by mortgaging his house. The first years were tough. Alexander worked 18 hours a day, often slept on a cot in the office, and ate instant noodles. But his persistence paid off. Neuratech created the first truly effective speech recognition system, and this opened the door to the world of big contracts and investments. Every year the company grew, expanded, and absorbed competitors. Alexander went from an unknown programmer to one of the most influential figures in Silicon Valley. He was invited to speak at TED conferences. His photo appeared on the covers of Forbes and Time. He advised presidents and prime ministers on technology and artificial intelligence. But along with success came isolation. The richer Alexander became, the less he socialized with ordinary people. His entourage was made up of the same billionaires, politicians, and celebrities. He could not remember the last time he went to the store for groceries or stood in line at a cafe. And now it was as if fate had decided to teach him a lesson. The man who could organize a meeting with any Fortune 500 CEO with a single phone call had to pretend to be an ordinary worker to save his brainchild. Pulling into JFK Airport, Alexander parked in the staff parking lot. He pulled a fake ID in the name of Alex Smith from the glove compartment and pinned it to the breast pocket of his shirt. Taking a deep breath, Sterling got out of the car. Airport employees, pilots, stewardesses, ground staff scurried around him. No one paid any attention to him. To them, he was just another employee rushing to his morning shift. Alexander headed toward the service entrance to the terminal. His heart was pounding frantically. He realized that the strangest and possibly most important work week of his life was about to begin. Walking through the turnstile on the fake pass, Sterling mentally chuckled. If someone had told him a month ago that he would be loading luggage at the airport, he would have thought the person was crazy. But here he was, willing to do anything to save his life's work. Well, Alex Smith, he thought as he entered the staff room, welcome to a new life. Thus began the unusual adventure of Alexander Sterling, the undercover billionaire. He didn't yet know that the next 2 weeks would not only change his company, but would completely turn his outlook on life, business, and human relationships upside down. A week ago, on May 16th, Alexander discovered critical documents missing from his Manhattan office. These papers contained details of the revolutionary artificial intelligence technology that his company, Neuratech, had been working on for the past 5 years. The loss of these documents could not only undermine the company's position in the marketplace, but also leak information to competitors. The morning of May 16th began as usual for Alexander Sterling. He arrived at the Neuratech office at 7:30 in the morning, an hour and a half before an important meeting with potential investors. Taking the elevator to the 42nd floor where his private office was located, Alexander nodded affably to his assistant, Sarah Chen. "Good morning, Mr. Sterling," Sarah smiled. "Coffee is already waiting for you on the table. I've prepared all the materials for the presentation." "Thank you, Sarah," Alexander replied as he entered his spacious office with panoramic windows overlooking Manhattan. He walked over to his mahogany desk, picked up a cup of flavored coffee and took a sip. Alexander then turned to the wall where an original Picasso painting hung, his favorite acquisition of recent years. He pushed the painting away slightly, revealing a safe built into the wall. Dialing a combination that only he knew, Alexander opened the safe, expecting to see a black leather folder with Project Prometheus embossed in gold. But the folder was not there. For the first few seconds, Sterling just stood there, staring at the empty space in the safe. His brain refused to believe what his eyes were seeing. Then panic came over him in a wave. "Sarah!" he shouted, running out of the office. "Get Frank Donovan on the phone right now!" Frank Donovan, Neuratech's head of security and a former FBI agent, arrived 10 minutes later. By this time, Alexander had already turned his entire office upside down, hoping that by some miracle he had moved the folder to another location and had simply forgotten about it. "What's wrong, sir?" Donovan asked, entering the office. Alexander briefly explained the situation. Frank's face grew serious. "When was the last time you saw the paperwork?" he asked. "Last night, before I went home," Alexander replied. "I was going over them in preparation for today's presentation." The next few hours passed like a blur. Frank and his team reviewed security footage, interviewed employees, and checked floor access logs. Alexander was forced to cancel a meeting with the investors, citing a sudden indisposition. By evening, it became clear that the documents could not be found using the usual methods. The camera footage did not show anything suspicious. None of the staff entered Sterling's office after he left. The safe hadn't been broken into. It had been locked when Alexander had opened it in the morning. "Mr. Sterling," Frank said, entering Alexander's office late that night, "I think we should go to the police." Alexander shook his head. "No, Frank. We can't take that risk. If word of the leak leaks to the press, the company's stock will plummet. We'll lose the confidence of investors and customers." "But, sir," Donovan began. "No police," Alexander said firmly. "We'll handle this on our own." The next day, Alexander hired the best detective agency in New York. He paid them a huge sum for urgency and confidentiality. The detectives began their investigation, but days went by with no results. Meanwhile, Alexander was forced to play a role. He kept going to meetings, smiling at corporate events, pretending that everything was going according to plan. But inside, he was devastated. 5 years of work, millions of dollars of investment, all of it could go to waste because of one night. Every night when he returned home to his penthouse, Alexander felt the weight of responsibility weighing on his shoulders. He couldn't sleep, constantly running through possible scenarios in his head. Who could have stolen the documents? A competitor? A disgruntled employee? Foreign spies? On the 5th day after the disappearance of the documents, Alexander sat in his office, reviewing yet another useless detective report. His gaze happened to fall on a photograph on the desk. It showed him with his father on their last fishing trip together, a month before the elder Sterling had passed away from a heart attack. "Always remember, son," Alexander heard his father's voice as if in real life, "there's no problem that can't be solved by approaching it from the other side." And then it hit him. He had been so focused on finding the intruder among the senior staff that he had lost sight of the rest of the staff. What if the documents were still in the building, hidden where no one would ever guess to look? Alexander recalled a conversation he had overheard by chance a week ago. 2 cleaning staff members were discussing a strange package they had found in a dumpster in the parking lot. They had taken it to the lost and found at JFK Airport, where one of them worked part-time on weekends. At the time, this information seemed insignificant to Sterling, but now he stood up abruptly from his desk and began pacing the office. A plan, crazy and risky, began to form in his mind. If the documents really are at the airport, he has a chance to find them before they fall into the wrong hands. But to do that, he would have to do something he had never done before, become a regular employee. Alexander walked to the window and looked out at the city spread out below. He had built an empire, changed the world with technology, but would he be able to handle the job of an ordinary loader at the airport? He pulled out his cell phone and dialed a number. "Frank, it's Sterling. I need your help. And don't say a word to anyone." The next 2 days passed in feverish preparations. Frank Donovan, using his connections, organized false documents for Alexander in the name of Alex Smith. Sarah Chen, Sterling's assistant, was instructed to cancel all meetings for the next 2 weeks, citing her boss's sudden illness. Alexander bought a used Ford Focus to keep a low profile. He grew light stubble to change his appearance a bit. Frank spent a few hours with him, teaching him the basics of working at the airport and giving him tips on how to behave so as not to arouse suspicion. And then came the morning of May 23rd. Alexander Sterling, billionaire and technological genius, stood in front of the mirror in simple workman's clothes, preparing to embark on the strangest adventure of his life. "You can handle it," he told his reflection. "You've got to make it." With those words, he left his luxurious penthouse and got into an unremarkable Ford Focus, heading toward JFK Airport. After unsuccessfully trying to find the documents through legal methods, Alexander decided on a desperate move. His last clue indicated that the documents might have been hidden in the baggage claim at John F. Kennedy International Airport. On May 24th at 5 o'clock in the morning, Alexander Sterling, dressed in a simple blue trucker's uniform, got behind the wheel for the first time in 20 years, not of his Bentley, but of a shabby 2010-year-old Ford Focus. He was on his way to the airport to start his first shift as Alex Smith, the new baggage handler. The drive from his penthouse on Park Avenue to JFK Airport took about an hour. During that time, Alexander had time to replay his legend in his head several times. Alex Smith, 35 years old, had recently moved to New York City from Omaha, Nebraska, in search of new opportunities. Divorced, no children, lives in a rented apartment in Queens. His previous work experience was as a storekeeper at a supermarket. Driving up to the airport service entrance, Alexander felt his heart begin to beat more frequently. He parked his Ford in the staff parking lot and took a deep breath, looking at himself in the rearview mirror. "You can do it," he whispered to his reflection. "You're Alex Smith, a regular guy who just wants to do his job well." Getting out of the car, Alexander headed toward the service entrance. Around him, other airport workers were scurrying around, pilots in pressed uniforms, stewardesses with perfect hairstyles, technicians with tools. No one paid any attention to him, and it was oddly comforting. He was met at the entrance by Jim Collins, the baggage room shift supervisor. He was a stocky man in his 50s with a bushy mustache and a good-natured expression. "You must be new," Jim said, shaking Alexander's hand. "Alex, right?" "Yes, sir," Alexander replied, trying to speak differently than usual. "Alex Smith. Pleased to meet you." "Drop the sir thing," Jim grinned. "Everyone here is one of our own. Come on, I'll show you around." The next hour passed like a blur. Jim led Alexander through the huge labyrinth of the baggage room, showing the various conveyors, sorting stations, and loading bays. Alexander struggled to remember every detail, realizing it could be the key to finding the missing documents. "Now for the most important part," Jim said, leading Alexander to a small room at the end of the hallway. "Our break room. This is where we keep our personal belongings, eat lunch, and sometimes hide from our superiors." Jim winked, and Alexander smiled tentatively back. "Your locker number 123, Jim continued, pointing to a row of metal lockers. "You should have gotten the code with your paperwork." Alexander nodded, remembering the 4-digit code Frank Donovan had given him. "Great," Jim said. "Now let's get to work. Your first task is to unload the flight from London. Terminal 4, Gate B18. Mike will show you what to do." Mike turned out to be a tall, lean guy of about 25 with a mop of red hair and freckles all over his face. He gave Alexander a friendly nod and led him to the baggage carousel. "First day, huh?" Mike asked as they walked. "Don't worry, you'll get used to it soon. The main thing is don't tire yourself out. Those suitcases weigh like an elephant sometimes." The next few hours were the most physically demanding of Alexander's life. He lifted and moved hundreds of suitcases, bags and boxes, feeling his muscles, accustomed to the comfortable chair in the office, screaming from the strain. "Hey, new guy!" Mike shouted around noon. "Lunch break!" Alexander followed Mike into the break room with relief. The other employees were already gathered there, munching sandwiches and discussing the latest news. "So what brings you to JFK, Alex?" Mike asked, opening a can of soda. Alexander hesitated for a second, remembering his legend. "You know, looking for new opportunities. There's not much to go around in Omaha." "Omaha?" Someone from the corner of the room interjected. "My cousin lives there. Says it's a quiet town." Alexander felt a chill run down his spine. He wasn't ready to be asked about Omaha. "Yeah, quiet," he muttered. "Maybe even too much so." Fortunately, the conversation quickly shifted to other topics. Alexander was surprised to find that he was interested in listening to the stories of his new colleagues, about difficult passengers, strange finds in luggage, dreams and plans for the future. After lunch, the work continued. By the end of the shift, Alexander's arms were aching, his back was aching, and his legs seemed to weigh a ton each. But despite the fatigue, he felt a strange satisfaction. While changing into his regular clothes at the end of the day, Alexander heard two workers discussing something in a low voice. "Strange find, I tell you," one said. "Leather folder with some papers in it. Who carries something like that in a suitcase anyway?" Alexander's heart jumped. Could this be what he was looking for? "And where is that folder now?" the second employee asked. "At the lost and found, where else?" replied the first. "But if the owner isn't found in a month, it will be sent for destruction. Those are the rules." Alexander barely held back an exclamation. He had a month to find the documents. But how to access the lost and found? Walking out of the airport, he felt a mixture of fatigue and excitement. His first day undercover had been tough but productive. Now he had a purpose and a direction to search. Sitting in his Ford Focus, Alexander allowed himself to close his eyes for a moment. Tomorrow would be a new day, new challenges. But today, he deserved a rest. The billionaire, pretending to be an ordinary employee, started the engine and headed home to his luxurious penthouse, where a hot bath and a soft bed awaited him. Tomorrow he would be Alex Smith again, a baggage handler at JFK Airport. The next 2 weeks were a real challenge for Alexander. Accustomed to comfort and luxury, he now spent 12 hours a day carrying heavy suitcases, socializing with his working-class colleagues, and trying to discreetly explore every corner of the baggage area. His hands, accustomed to keyboards and handshakes in conference rooms, were covered in calluses. His back ached mercilessly every evening. But Alexander was determined to find the stolen documents. Every morning, waking up in his luxurious penthouse, Alexander carefully prepared for his role. He donned worn jeans and a simple shirt, carefully hiding the traces of his real life. An expensive watch was replaced by a cheap electronic model, and his well-groomed hands were deliberately dirty with machine oil to match the image of a worker. At work, Alexander tried to fit in with the team. He listened attentively to his colleagues' conversations, memorizing their stories, problems, and dreams. Gradually, he began to realize how different the lives of these people were compared to his usual surroundings. Mike, his partner, turned out to be a college student who worked at the airport to pay for his education. He dreamed of becoming an engineer, but his family couldn't afford the expensive tuition. "You know, Alex," Mike once said during a lunch break, Sometimes I look at these airplanes and think, maybe one day I'll design one of those. But then I think about the college bills and realize I'll probably spend the rest of my life carrying other people's suitcases. These words touched Alexander deeply. He remembered how he himself had once started from scratch with only a dream and $10,000 borrowed from his father. Now, having become a billionaire, he had almost forgotten what it was like to fight for his dream. Despite the physical fatigue and emotional strain, Alexander never forgot his main goal. Every day he tried to find a way to break into the lost and found. He asked his colleagues about procedures, studied the guards' shift schedules, and looked for weaknesses in the security system. On the 10th day of his employment, Alexander finally got his chance. During the night shift, he overheard one of the guards complaining of a headache. "Hey, buddy," Alexander said as he approached the guard. "I've got some great painkillers. Want some?" The guard gratefully accepted the pill, and after a while, he fell asleep. Alexander seized the moment and slipped into the lost and found. His heart pounded frantically as he began browsing the shelves of forgotten items, suitcases, bags, umbrellas. Everything seemed to be here except his file folder. Suddenly, the light of a flashlight illuminated the room. "Hey, what are you doing here?" came a gruff voice. Alexander turned around and saw another guard looking at him suspiciously. I was looking for a fellow passenger's lost luggage," Alexander quickly lied. "He's very upset and I wanted to help." The guard frowned. "You're not supposed to be here. Get out before I notify my superiors." Alexander hurriedly left the lost and found, feeling frustrated and afraid. He'd been so close, but he hadn't found the documents, and now he risked being exposed. For the next few days, Alexander was especially careful. He tried not to draw attention to himself, working hard and maintaining friendly relations with his colleagues. But in the back of his mind, he realized that time was running out, and he was still no closer to his goal. One evening, as Alexander was about to go home, Jim, the shift supervisor, approached him. "Hey, Alex," Jim said, "you're doing a good job. How about taking an extra shift tomorrow? We've got a man down sick and there's a lot of flights." Alexander felt the fatigue come over him. His body begged for rest, but his mind said this might be a chance. "Of course, Jim," he replied. "I'd be glad to help." The next day, during an extra shift, Alexander noticed an unusual buzz among the security staff. It turned out that an important government delegation was arriving at the airport, and every effort had been thrown into ensuring their safety. Taking advantage of the commotion, Alexander broke into the lost and found office again. This time he had more time to search. He methodically went through every shelf, every drawer, and suddenly, in the farthest corner, under a pile of old umbrellas, he saw a familiar black leather folder with gold embossing. Alexander's heart skipped a beat. He grabbed the folder and quickly checked the contents. Everything was in place: blueprints, calculations, descriptions of algorithms, documents that could change the future of his company and the entire technology industry. But now Alexander faced a new dilemma: how to take the folder out of the airport without arousing suspicion, and what to do next. After all, if he suddenly disappeared, it could raise questions and undermine the entire operation. With the folder hidden under his jacket, Alexander returned to his duties, feverishly pondering his next move. He realized that his every action now had to be especially careful and thoughtful. While he was pondering his situation, Mike approached him. "Hey, Alex," he said with a smile, "me and the guys are going to the bar tonight. We're going to celebrate my birthday. Are you coming?" Alexander hesitated. On the one hand, he needed to urgently solve the issue with the documents. On the other, an abrupt refusal could arouse suspicion. "Sure, Mike," he finally answered. "I'd be happy to join you." An evening at the bar with his co-workers proved to be a real challenge for Alexander Sterling. Sitting at a table with a bottle of cheap beer he'd barely tasted, the undercover billionaire listened intently to the conversations around him while contemplating his next move. The folder of classified documents hidden in his locker at the airport kept him on his toes. "Hey, Alex!" Mike's voice snapped Alexander out of his reverie. "Why are you so glum? Relax, it's a holiday." Alexander tried to smile. "Sorry, friend. Just tired after a double shift." "Yeah, it's a tough job," Mike sighed. "But sometimes I think these rich people who fly first class have no idea how ordinary people live." Those words struck a nerve with Alexander. He remembered how until a month ago he himself flew only private planes, without thinking about the people who keep the airport running. "Maybe they're not all that bad," Alexander remarked cautiously. "Ha! You just haven't encountered them up close," snorted another colleague, John. "Take this Sterling guy from Neurotech, for example. They say he's going to cut half the jobs by replacing humans with robots." Alexander almost choked on his beer. "Where did that information come from?" he asked, trying to hide his excitement. "Rumor has it," John shrugged. "My cousin works there, in the tech department. Says something's brewing." The rest of the evening passed like a blur. Alexander could barely concentrate on the conversations, his thoughts preoccupied with the information he'd heard. Was his company really planning such radical changes? And why didn't he, the CEO, know anything about it? The next morning, instead of going to the airport, Alexander went to the Neurotech office. For the first time in 2 weeks, he put on an expensive suit and got behind the wheel of his Bentley. But something had changed. He was looking at the world through different eyes. Upon entering the company building, Alexander went straight to the Human Resources Department. He demanded to see all the plans for restructuring the company. The employees were shocked by his sudden appearance and unusual questions, but did not dare to disobey. An hour later, Alexander was sitting in his office reviewing documents. What he had learned shook him to the core. Indeed, a group of top managers led by Chief Financial Officer Richard Hawkins had developed a cost-cutting plan that included mass layoffs and replacing people with automated systems. This plan was to be presented to the board of directors in a week. Alexander felt anger boiling up inside him. How could they plan such drastic changes without his knowledge? And most importantly, how could he himself be so detached from reality that he didn't notice what was happening in his own company? Instead of calling the police immediately, Alexander decided to deal with the situation on his own. He began by calling Richard Hawkins over to him. "Explain to me, Richard, why am I learning about my company's restructuring plans from the workers at the airport?" Alexander asked as soon as Hawkins entered the office. The CFO turned pale. "Alex, Mr. Sterling, I don't know what you mean." "Enough lies." Alexander slammed his palm on the desk. "I know about the downsizing plan, and about the fact that you were going to present it to the board of directors without my knowledge. But what I want to know is, why did you steal documents about the new AI technology?" Hawkins slumped in his chair, his face expressing a mixture of fear. We wanted to protect the company, Alex. This new technology, it's too dangerous. If it's implemented, thousands of people will lose their jobs. We thought if we hid the documents, you'd give up the idea." Alexander was stunned. He found out that it wasn't a competitor who had stolen the documents, but a group of his own employees who were unhappy with Neurotech's corporate policies. "Who else is involved in this?" Alexander asked. Hawkins gave the names of several other top managers. All of them were people Alexander trusted, people he had worked side by side with for years. Alexander spent the next few hours talking to each of them. He listened to their concerns, their arguments, their fears. And with each conversation, he realized more and more how far he was from the real problems of his company and the people who worked in it. By evening, Alexander made a decision. He gathered all the company's employees in a large conference room. "I spent the last 2 weeks working as a longshoreman at the airport," he began his speech, causing shock and bewilderment in the audience. "I did it to find stolen documents about our new technology. But I found so much more. I found insight into how ordinary people live, how they fight for their dreams, how they fear losing their jobs." Alexander paused, circling the faces of the employees. "I learned that my own company was planning massive layoffs, that people I trusted were willing to go on a crime spree to prevent the introduction of a technology they thought could put thousands of people out of work." He took a deep breath. "I realized that somewhere along the way I had lost touch with reality. I had forgotten that technology is supposed to serve people, not replace them. So I made a decision." The entire room froze in anticipation. "We will not be making layoffs. Instead, we will channel our new AI technology into job creation. We will train our employees to work with AI, not replace them. We'll increase investment in education programs and social projects." A surprised whisper swept through the room. "Moreover," Alexander continued, "I plan to make changes to the company's management structure. We will create an employee council that will have a voice in making important decisions. I want everyone in this company to feel heard and valued." When Alexander finished his speech, there was silence in the hall, and then applause erupted. It grew until the entire hall was filled with applause. That evening, sitting in his office and looking at the lights of the city at night, Alexander Sterling felt that he was beginning a new chapter in his life and in the history of his company. The next day he drove to the airport, but not in his Bentley, but in the very same used Ford Focus. He found Mike and the rest of the guys in the break room. "Hey guys," he said as he walked in. "Alex, and we thought you quit," Mike smiled. "Not really," Alexander replied. "I came to say thanks and to say goodbye. But this isn't the end, it's the beginning." He told them the truth about himself, about his company, about how their friendship had changed the way he looked at the world. "I want to offer you a job," he said at the end. "Not as movers, but as specialists in implementing AI and logistics. We'll train you, pay for your education. What do you say?" Mike and the others were stunned, but in their eyes Alexander saw what he had been looking for all these years: hope and faith in the future. Walking out of the airport, Alexander Sterling knew his life would never be the same again. He had found something far more valuable than stolen documents. He had found new meaning in his work and a new understanding of the responsibility his position held. New challenges lay ahead of him: changing the corporate culture, introducing new management principles, gaining the trust of employees. All this required time and effort. But now, Alexander was ready for the journey. He got into his Ford Focus and drove to the office. He had a lot of work to do, but now this work brought him real satisfaction. Because now he knew that his success was the success of thousands of people who worked side by side with him, and that knowledge was worth all the billions in the world. A year after the events at JFK Airport, Neurotech was transformed beyond recognition. The revolutionary artificial intelligence technology that started the whole event was successfully implemented, but not as originally planned. Instead of massive layoffs, Neurotech created more than 5,000 new jobs. A retraining program helped hundreds of employees learn new skills and move into higher-paying positions. The company has invested millions of dollars in educational programs and social projects, becoming an example of socially responsible business. Alexander Sterling, the company's CEO, now rarely appeared in the office in expensive suits. He preferred simple clothes and often spent time in the production and development departments, interacting with ordinary employees. His new leadership style, based on openness and trust, changed Neurotech's corporate culture. The Employee Council, created at Alexander's initiative, has become an integral part of the company's decision-making process. Now, every employee, from the janitor to the top manager, could make suggestions and be heard. Mike, Alexander's former partner at the airport, was now the head of AI implementation in logistics. His dream of becoming an engineer had come true even more grandly than he could have imagined. The company had fully paid for his tuition at a prestigious technical university. John and Alexander's other former colleagues from the airport also found their place at Neuratech. Their hands-on experience has proved invaluable in developing new logistics solutions using AI. Project Humanity, as the new AI technology was named, didn't replace humans, but empowered them. AI was used to improve working conditions, increase safety, and create new, more interesting and higher-paying positions. Neuratech's financial performance was also impressive. The company's stock rose 200% year-over-year and profits doubled. But more importantly, employee satisfaction reached a record 98%. Alexander visited JFK Airport regularly, but now not as a baggage handler, but as a consultant. He helped implement new technologies that made it easier for employees to work and more efficient operations. Alexander's personal life also changed. He sold his luxury penthouse and moved to a more modest house in the suburbs. He spent every weekend volunteering at a local community organization, helping people learn new technologies and find jobs. The story of Alexander Sterling and Neuratech became a model for other companies. Many CEOs have followed his example, rethinking their approach to implementing new technologies and treating employees.